I need to tell you about the 8 months I spent working overnight at a self-storage facility called Safe Haven Storage. And before you say anything, yes, I know how that name sounds in retrospect. Safe Haven. I did not choose the name. It was already called that when I got there, and I'm sure whoever named it was just going for reassuring and convenient and not thinking about how it would sound later when I was telling this story. But there it is. Safe Haven Storage. That's where I worked from October of one year to the following June. And that stretch of time taught me things about silence and darkness, and the specific quality of a building full of other people's belongings that I did not know before and have never been able to know since. I took the job because the money was decent and the requirements were minimal, and I was 23 and finishing a degree part-time and needed something that would let me be relatively stationary for 8 hours so I could study. The overnight shift at a self-storage facility seemed ideal for that. The job was essentially this: sit at the front desk from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., monitor the security cameras, do a walking round of the facility every 2 hours, log anything unusual, call the emergency line if anything actually happened. In 8 months, the most dramatic thing that happened was a raccoon getting into the dumpster near the south entrance, which I logged as an animal intrusion and which remains the most interesting entry in that log from the months I worked there, until the last few weeks anyway. Let me tell you about the facility first, because the physical layout matters. Safe Haven was a medium-sized operation, not huge, not tiny. 2 main buildings of interior climate-controlled units, 1 long single-story building of exterior drive-up units, and the office where I spent most of my time. The interior buildings were the ones you walked through to get to individual units, long fluorescent-lit hallways with metal roll-up doors on either side, the kind of place that has a very specific echo to it. Footsteps and the sound of your own breathing bouncing off metal and concrete in a way that you always knew exactly how alone you were. The exterior building was the one that faced the back fence, the farthest from the office, and it was the one I liked least on my rounds. Not for any reason I could initially articulate, just a preference my feet seemed to have developed for saving it for last. The overnight shift in a storage facility is one of the quietest jobs I have ever had. Quieter than a library, quieter than a hospital, quieter even than that, because at least in a library or a hospital there are living people around, their presence creating a kind of ambient warmth even when they're silent. A storage facility at 2 in the morning has no living people in it except you. What it has instead is things, rooms and hallways of things, packed into boxes and wrapped in plastic and stacked on shelves and covered in sheets, all the accumulated physical evidence of people's lives sitting in the dark waiting for someone to want them again, or in some cases, and you learn this quickly in a storage job, never to be wanted again. Some units don't get visited for months at a time. Some of them you start to realize haven't been opened in years. I got comfortable with the quiet after the first few weeks. You have to, or the job becomes impossible. You learn to hear the difference between the building settling and something that requires investigation, between the HVAC cycling on and something moving, between the ordinary sounds of a large metal and concrete structure existing in the cold and sounds that don't belong. You develop a kind of internal calibration that becomes automatic. By December, I could do my rounds without any particular alertness, just the mechanical noting of each section, each hallway, each row of exterior units, everything in order, nothing to report. The first thing I noticed was in Building B, the second interior building, in the hallway they called the 200 corridor. This was a longer hallway than the others, running the full length of the building, and it had a bend in it about 2/3 of the way down where the original construction had added a section onto an existing structure. So the hallway made an L, and the section past the bend was slightly newer than the section before it. I don't know why I noticed the difference in construction. I just did. Over time, the way you notice everything about a space you spend a lot of time in. What I noticed in the 200 corridor was that Unit 247 was always slightly warmer than the units around it. Not dramatically. Not, hey, there's a fire warm, just a degree or two, consistently, every time I passed it on rounds. The kind of warmth you register as a patch in the air before you've consciously processed where it's coming from. I mentioned it to the day manager when I saw him at shift change one morning, and he nodded without much interest and said the insulation in that section was inconsistent and some units ran warm. He said it had been that way for years. I said okay and filed it away. But I started paying attention to 247. I don't know exactly why. The warmth and something else I couldn't name. Just the quality of the air near that particular door that was different from the air near every other door. Not threatening, just different, present in some way that empty storage units are not usually present. About 6 weeks into the job, I was doing my 2 a.m. round, and I was in the 200 corridor, past the bend, coming up toward 247, and I heard something. Music, very faint, the kind of faint where you're not sure if you're hearing it or imagining it. A melody, slow and simple, the kind of tune that feels like it's from a long time ago without being able to say why. I stopped walking and stood still and listened, and it was there. Not imaginary, not the HVAC, actually there, thin and quiet and coming from somewhere in the vicinity of Unit 247. I stood in that hallway for probably 2 full minutes listening. Then it stopped. Just stopped. No fade, just gone. The corridor as silent as it always was. I finished my round and logged it as unusual sound in 200 corridor, possible audio bleed from adjacent property, resolved without incident. The adjacent property was a neighborhood of houses about 100 yards away, across a fence and some scrub. The chance that music from one of those houses was carrying at 2 in the morning through a concrete building and manifesting at a specific location in a specific hallway was essentially zero. But I was not ready to write anything else in the log, and I needed to write something. I heard it 3 more times over the next month. Always in the 200 corridor, always near 247, always late, between 2 and 4 in the morning, never on my earlier rounds. Always the same quality of sound, that faint, thin melody that felt like it was coming from somewhere else in addition to coming from somewhere nearby. I never heard it long enough to identify what the tune was. Just the shape of it, slow and simple, and then nothing. In January, I looked up who rented Unit 247. I want to be straightforward about the fact that this was not technically within the scope of my job, and I want to be equally straightforward about the fact that I was alone in a building 5 nights a week at 2 in the morning hearing music come out of a storage unit, and my curiosity had exceeded my professional discretion. I had access to the rental records in the system. I looked. The unit was rented to a woman named Eleanor Marsh. The rental agreement was dated 11 years prior. The emergency contact was listed as a son, with a phone number that had an area code from a city about 4 hours away. The unit had been paid on a recurring automatic payment for 11 years without interruption. No record of the unit being accessed in the system in over 3 years. 3 years since anyone had opened that door. I sat with that for a while. I thought about the warmth near that door and the music and the 11 years of things sitting in the dark in there, and I thought about Eleanor Marsh and her son 4 hours away. I wondered if Eleanor Marsh was still alive. I wondered if her son knew what was in that unit or had simply kept paying for it because some automatic thing had been set up and he'd never gotten around to dealing with it or couldn't bear to deal with it. I wondered what was in there. What someone keeps in a storage unit for 11 years and visits and then stops visiting. I didn't hear the music in February or March. I'd almost stopped expecting it. And then in April, a Tuesday night, I was in the 200 corridor at my 3 a.m. round, and it was there again. Stronger than before. Still faint. Still that same quality of being far away and nearby at once. But there was no question this time. No wondering if I was imagining it. A melody, slow and simple, coming from behind the metal door of Unit 247. I stood in front of the door and I listened. And then, without entirely deciding to, I knocked. I know how that sounds. I knocked on the door of a storage unit at 3 in the morning because I could hear music inside it. I'm not going to defend the logic. I knocked twice, lightly, knuckles on metal, and then felt immediately foolish about it and stood back. The music stopped. And then, after maybe 10 seconds of complete silence, it started again. Different. The same melody. But I want to be careful here because this sounds like the kind of thing you embroider for effect, but I'm telling it straight. It seemed closer to the door, as though whatever was making the sound had moved toward the door when I knocked, as though it had heard me. I did not knock again. I backed up a few steps, and I stood there and I listened to the music for about another minute, and then I walked away and finished my round. My hands were not entirely steady when I wrote in the log. I wrote 200 corridor, all clear. I wrote nothing else. I looked up Eleanor Marsh online when I got home that morning. It took a while because it's not an unusual name, but I eventually found an obituary, about 2 years old, from the city 4 hours away. Eleanor Ruth Marsh, aged 79, survived by her son and 2 grandchildren. She had been a music teacher for 35 years, the obituary said. Piano primarily, but also voice. A music teacher for 35 years. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I read that obituary 3 times. And I thought about the warmth near her unit door, about the music that had been there for months, and then gone quiet, and then come back. About the way it had moved toward the door when I knocked, like it heard me, like it knew I was there. I'm not going to tell you Eleanor Marsh was haunting her storage unit. I'm not going to tell you the music was her. I genuinely don't know what I believe, and I think claiming to know would be dishonest. And I'm trying to be honest with you through this whole thing. What I can tell you is what I experienced and what the record showed, and let you do whatever you're going to do with the combination of those things. What I can tell you is that after I found the obituary, I went back to work that Thursday night, and I went to the 200 corridor earlier than my scheduled round. I went there first, before anything else, and I walked up to Unit 247, and I stood in front of the door, and I said, out loud, quietly, because I was alone in a corridor in a storage facility at 10:30 at night, I'm sorry about your things. I hope you knew someone would listen. I felt a little crazy saying it. I want to be upfront about that. I stood there in the fluorescent light of that corridor and talked to a metal door and felt fully aware of how that would look if anyone were watching. But it also felt like the right thing to do. It felt necessary in some way I can't entirely explain. The door was warm under my hand when I touched it briefly before I walked away. Warmer than it should have been. Warmer than any insulation inconsistency could account for. I finished out my time at Safe Haven. I left in June when my schedule shifted and I found something else. I never heard the music again after that April night. The last 2 months of the job, the 200 corridor was quiet, and the air near 247 was the same temperature as everything else around it. I think about Eleanor Marsh sometimes. I think about 35 years of teaching piano to children, and I think about whatever she kept in that unit and why she kept it there and what it meant to her. I think about her son 4 hours away who might still be paying for it, who might have no idea. I think about all those other units and all those other facilities, full of all those other people's things, sitting in the dark being quietly, privately significant to someone who isn't there to explain why. I hope she found wherever she was going. I hope it had a piano. And I hope, if she happened to hear me that night in the corridor, I hope it helped a little, knowing someone had listened. Sleep well, Eleanor.